Thank you for joining me for Session 7 of Explore the Bible Sunday School Lessons. The title is Commands, and the text is Mark chapter 9, verse 14 to 27. The way I began the lesson with my class is I just wrote on the board the lesson point, belief in Jesus is essential in all areas of life. And then I took the time to talk through that lesson point. I said, this is what the lesson is about. It's about belief. Our English word, belief, is made up of two Old English words, the word live and the word by. They put them together and made this word believe. You live by what you believe. The biblical word for faith is pretty much the same idea, but there's three aspects to biblical faith. I've shared these before, but it's always good to remind people of these things. There are three aspects to it. First, there's knowledge. People have to know some things about God, and that's why we're called to be witnesses. The second thing is agreement or assent. They agree that Jesus is the Son of God. They agree that his death on the cross paid for our sins, that he was buried, and that he rose from the grave 3 days later and ascended to the Father and is the sovereign of the universe. They agree on those things. They believe they're true. And if you were to ask a lot of people in my community if they believe those things, they would. But that doesn't mean they're necessarily a Christian. Because there's a third aspect. There's knowledge, there's assent, and third, there's action. James said that if faith has no works, it's dead. And true biblical faith always acts upon these beliefs. Hence, in the English word, live by or believe. Now notice it's not just belief in faith, but it's belief in Jesus. He's the object of our belief. And that makes all the difference in the world. When I was in Minnesota last winter, spending some time with my grandchildren, we went to a lake they have at a park, a beautiful lake, a beautiful park. And it was February, and this small lake was frozen over. You don't see that much here in Oklahoma. In fact, I've never seen it. And when we got there, you could tell out in the middle of that small lake, there had been people who had been ice fishing because they had drilled holes in the ice and there was a pile of ice next to the hole. And my grandsons went running across that lake, frozen lake, to look at those holes. Well, I'm a little more tentative, and I'm examining the ice as we go there, and when we finally do get out to where the hole is at, that ice must have been 8, 10, 12 inches thick. It was amazing. Well, my grandsons didn't stay on top of that ice because they had great faith, and I didn't fall through the ice because I had small faith. Their great faith and my small faith still had the same outcome because we had confidence in the ice. And this lesson is about belief in Jesus. And it says this is essential. Now, I looked up the word essential in the dictionary, and it means indispensable. This is something you can't do without. You have to have belief in Jesus. It said it's necessary. There are a lot of things in life that are important to us and significant to us, but they're not necessary. You don't have to have them, but you have to have belief in Jesus. It's essential to be a follower of Christ. And it says not subject to be set aside. It's not something you can do without. It's absolutely necessary. Belief in Jesus is essential. It's indispensable. And the last part of the phrase says in all areas of life. We tend to think in areas of salvation, but that's not what this lesson's about. This lesson is saying belief in Jesus for a follower of Christ is essential in all areas of life. Now, the points of the lesson point out what some of those areas are. Belief in Jesus is essential in the area of powerlessness. That's the first point in the lesson. Belief in Jesus is essential in those times of hopelessness. That's what this lesson talks about. Belief in Jesus is essential in the area of faithlessness, for that's the third point of the lesson. And the lesson concludes with faithful. That is, Jesus is faithful. That's why you can have belief in Jesus in all areas of life. It's essential for a disciple of Christ. Now, let's back up and look at the bigger context to understand why this issue on belief, because that's the point of the lesson, why this issue on belief is so essential. Why is Mark telling us another healing story? When you look at the Gospel of Mark, the first part of the Gospel of Mark, you have a certain reaction after Jesus performs these miracles and these exorcisms. In chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 4, chapter 5, when you read the crowd's response or the disciples' response, it is a consistent response that Mark records for us. They are amazed. What Mark does in the first half of his gospel is he is identifying Jesus as the Messiah. And the conclusion of that is at the end of chapter 8, when Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You're the Christ." And so they begin to understand who this person is. They begin to have belief in Jesus as the Messiah. But the second half of Mark's gospel is different. There's only 3 miracles. There's the miracle we're going to study here, and then there's a miracle in chapter 10, another healing and exorcism, and then there's the resurrection. Only 3 miracles. But something changes after each of those miracles. It's not that the crowd's in amazement. After each one of those miracles, it's a time of teaching with Jesus and his disciples. And what you recognize in the Gospel of Mark is the thing that Jesus keeps building into his disciples is their ability to believe him, their faith in him. One of the things that is essential for these disciples to get clear is they need to have faith in Jesus. When you look at the assignments that Jesus gives the disciples, when you look at the encounters they have in terms of healings and exorcisms, when you look at the times of teaching in Mark's gospel, there is a consistent theme that runs throughout it, and that is you need to have faith in me. Because after his death, burial, resurrection, and ascension, for them to carry on the ministry of Jesus, they need to have unequivocal faith in Jesus. And so this is why the lesson is so important for us as followers of Christ. In the first half, it's affirming and identifying for us that Jesus is our Messiah. In the second half of Mark's gospel, he's affirming and identifying what it looks like to be a follower, to be a disciple of Jesus. And what is essential to be a follower of Jesus? You must have faith in Jesus. You must believe Jesus. It's essential, and not just for salvation, in all areas of life. So, it's more than just a verbal confession, for Peter said, "You're the Christ." It's more than just a recognition that Jesus is glorious. That was the transfiguration. The devil knows these things. So what is faith? Faith is belief and confidence in Jesus. It's essential for a disciple in all areas of life. So the first point is Mark chapter 9, verse 14 through 18, and the title is Powerless for point 1. We won't take time to go through the text. I'll just tell you what I did in terms of applying it. And I asked the class, what kinds of needs do people bring to church when they come to church? They are looking for help. And they mention things like, well, they're needing help with rebellious kids, or they're wanting help with a marriage, or maybe it's an addiction they're wanting to break, or they're experiencing a loss and grief and sorrow, and they're needing help in terms of experiencing comfort, or they're coming for the need for salvation. But what has led them to the church? Why or who have they been putting their faith in for those solutions? And there's a number of things that people do. Maybe it is their logic, their reason. Maybe it is the strength of their will. Maybe it's companions and friends. Maybe it is they're in a position of power, or maybe they put their confidence in money, or they put it into pleasure. But whatever, those things have failed them. And they're looking for something else that has power. And so they come to the church and they visit us. Now, their coming is an admission that they're powerless. And it is a confession that what we've been saying, that we have power in Jesus, is an admission of that. The sad part of this story is when this man brought his son to the disciples, there was a power failure on the part of the disciples. There's a lesson to be learned there, church. When people come and don't find the help they're needing in Jesus from the church, we need to recognize there has been a loss of focus in our belief in Jesus, because Jesus is powerful. The second point of the lesson is hopeless. Mark chapter 9, verse 19 through 21. And it starts verse 19 with this pitiful statement, this cry from the great heart of Jesus. You unbelieving generation, how long will I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring him to me. You know, Jesus never expressed that kind of discouragement with the world. He never expressed that kind of discouragement with Satan. He never said anything like that from the cross. We have 7 statements from Jesus from the cross. No time did he say something like this. He never said this about the crowd that pressed in on him and was so demanding of him he sometimes didn't have time to eat. What is it that wrung this statement from the great heart of Jesus? Unbelief from his disciples. This is how important this issue is. Matthew, when he tells this story, he adds a word to this description of Jesus. He says, you unbelieving and rebellious generation. That word rebellious means twisted. It means perverted. There's something terribly perverted. There's something terribly wicked about Christians who won't believe the Jesus that was revealed on the mountain of transfiguration. And so Jesus cries out. The way I took and applied the lesson is I said, I want us to look at 3 hopeless conditions, and I'd like for us to discuss the difference that Jesus makes in these 3 areas. One is disease. Many of us have a condition, a situation in which someone has a disease, an illness, and it looks hopeless. How does Jesus help us in that situation? It could be the issue of divorce. Many of us will know of a relationship that seems to be dying, and there's no way of recovering that. How does Jesus help us in such a hopeless situation? And then, of course, there's death, and there's no recovery of that. How does Jesus exhibit his power? How does belief in Jesus help us in that area? How is it essential? How does our faith in Jesus make these different as opposed to those without faith? The third point is faithless. Chapter 9, verse 22 through 24. The Father is a mixture of faith and doubt. I can identify with that. I certainly understand what he's saying. I do believe. Help me in my unbelief. And after we've dealt with the text, I wish we had time to do that. But after we've dealt with the text in the class, I asked the question, how did this man deal with his doubt? I mean, we all understand what he's saying. We've been there. How did he deal with his doubt? And there were several good responses. And my response was, first, he confessed it. He was honest with Jesus. Jesus already knows, so we might as well put it on the table and be honest with Jesus. So confess. I'm having some doubts here. I am uncertain here. The second thing was he yielded. The very first act of obedience, maybe it was a small step, but the very first act of obedience, he needed to obey. He did obey, and that was an act of faith. Now, this is not hopeful optimism. The certainty of faith depends on the insight of what God intends to do. We need to be certain that it's God's will. But once we're certain that this is what God intends to do and that it's God's will, then believers are to act upon that. So how do you close the gap between inadequacy and God's adequacy? The answer is faith in Jesus. Friend, belief in Jesus is essential in all areas of life. This is a lesson that's worth living with for a while. Now, I put the third point, faithless, and the fourth point, faithful. I put them together because though the Father was exhibiting faithlessness, Jesus is the faithful one. He exhibits the power of the living God. This is the way I conclude the lesson. For the last 2 Sundays, I have given them a postcard with a specific instruction. 2 weeks ago, I gave them a postcard. I said, would you, in applying the lesson, would you send this to someone and point them to Jesus? It may be a prayer that you want to pray for someone. It may be a word of encouragement, but would you, there's someone that comes to mind, and would you send them a card that points them to Jesus by your message? Last week, we saw that it's the compassion of Jesus that breaks down walls. And I said, there's somebody that comes to mind. And maybe there's a wall between you and them, and a word of love would help to bring down the wall. Or maybe it's a wall between them and God, and you could say something that would be gracious and generous and would begin to maybe break down that wall. Or maybe it's something within them. But write them a note or send them a prayer that breaks down the wall, reflecting the compassion of Christ. This lesson is your third opportunity. And I gave them a card. It was already posted, a postmark. They just needed to address it and to address the card. And I said, would you this time, as an act of obedience, would you send someone a postcard and invite them to Easter services? Or invite them to go to Easter services where they are? Now you might be thinking, well, what good is this postcard going to do if I send it to that person? That's your act of faith. Because, my friend, when you act on the will of God, when you have belief in Jesus, which is essential for believers, there is power. That's where you close the gap. It's a good lesson. I hope that you experience the fullness of this lesson this Sunday. God bless you.